I know that many students feel that they need to find the right answer about their text, that they need to have the right opinion or interpretation of the text. Actually, and this goes for your entire secondary schooling, we really want to give you the strategies and tools to develop your own interpretation of the text. This starts, of course, with your opinion, what you actually feel about the text, and it's important to think through that opinion and to discover where it comes from. Of course, when we write about a text analytically, we're not simply writing about our opinion. We're actually trying to analyze what the author was intending to do in the text and how they've executed that strategy. We start with our opinion, not because it's the central way that we will write about the text, but because it's an important step to understanding and developing our own interpretation of the text. Many students will look at study guides or go to us as the teachers of a class and really try to mimic what we think about a text. I always thought as a teacher that I would find that flattering, but actually I find it quite upsetting when students limit themselves to my interpretation because I don't actually have all the answers about the text. I love to read student responses that show me something new about a text. Developing your own interpretation of a text is really difficult though. It's hard to know when we first read a text what we really think about it and to decode everything that the author is trying to do in that text. What we're going to focus on now are some strategies that you can use to develop your own interpretation of the text. This is all about synthesizing and evaluating the information that you have been gathering as we've worked through this remote study series. It's about thinking again about the ideas and concepts that are central to the text that you are studying. Of course, you do have to be able to substantiate your ideas about the text with evidence from the text. It's important that our interpretation is grounded in the text itself. While there is not one correct answer about how you interpret a text, you do need to be able to show us that your opinion and your analysis comes from the text itself. Of course, we all bring something different to a text as readers, and that is one of the most exciting things about reading in my mind, that you and I can read the same book and interpret it very differently. In order for us to have a sincere and academic discussion, however, about that interpretation, we need to be able to show each other the evidence from the text. So let's look at an example now using Metal Fish Falling Snow. I'm starting with the theme of grief, and you will remember that there are a number of themes I identified in the text, but for the purpose of this, I'm going to look at that theme. What I'm going to work through now in terms of developing my interpretation is to think about what I believe the author, Kath Moore, is suggesting about grief in the text. So I've taken that theme, and then I am unpacking the ideas around that theme in the text. Each time that I generate an idea about this theme from the text, I'm going to use Kath Moore's name as a reminder to myself that this is a text that she has constructed in a particular way and that I, as the reader, am interpreting in a particular way. I'm then going to find some evidence for each of these ideas because, again, it's important to be able to substantiate my interpretation. So we start with the theme of grief. And the first idea that I think is evident in this text is that grief is all-consuming. It is incredibly powerful. So I have phrased that here as Moore reflects the power of grief. And I've used a quote here: "After the fall, the world shattered into 1,000 pieces." Now, the fall that Dylan, the narrator, is referring to there is the fall that killed her mother. So in this quote, I really get the sense that Kath Moore is showing us that for Dylan, that grief completely destroyed her world. It destroyed everything about what made her feel safe, what made her feel happy, and what made her feel seen because she was losing her mother. So here, Kath Moore is showing the power that grief can have over Dylan. Now, I have expanded out that idea. I haven't referred to Dylan in my statement about the ideas in the text because I think Moore is showing us more than just what happens with Dylan. And this really leads me to the second idea that I think is evident in the text around the notion of grief. Moore really looks at how individual grief is, that there's no one way that all of the characters experience their grief. And I've chosen a quote here that contains an interaction between Dylan and her mother's boyfriend, Pat. So Dylan writes or says in the text, "And now I see all of that plugging we'd done for each other hadn't worked because Pat's damn wall had burst, and the only thing I had for him now was a home brand tissue, crumpled up but still new." In that scene, Dylan and Pat are interacting, and Pat is really questioning Dylan and almost blaming Dylan for her mother's death. That's probably not something an adult would do if they were not feeling incredibly distraught and grieving themselves. So really what I see in this scene is that Moore is showing us that the characters are both grieving and grieving deeply, but they're not necessarily able to connect with each other's experience of grief. It looks different for both of them. And I think that's a really important idea connected to grief in the text. Lastly here, I've got this notion that Moore is showing us the transcendent qualities of grief. So the book has somewhat of a happy ending. That phrase sometimes is a little bit meaningless, but genuinely at the end of the text, the protagonist is much happier than at the start. She's found some connections, but her grief still transcends that happiness. It's still with her at the end of the text, even though her relationship to the grief has changed. So I've chosen a quote here that's from the last couple of pages of the book, where Dylan says, "Mum is still with me, but she has also disappeared." So to me, this quote shows that Dylan's relationship to her grief has changed, but she has not completely disconnected from that grief. It will always be with her. So here I'm really developing what I think Kath Moore is saying about grief in the text. And for every idea that I generate, I'm finding evidence from the text itself to make sure I can substantiate my opinion. So, of course, I'm going to ask you now to go through a very similar process. I would like you to pick one theme to begin with and to generate some ideas connected to that theme. Remember that you're going to start by expressing what you think the author is saying about that theme. For every idea that you generate, I would like you to provide some evidence of that idea from the text, preferably in the form of a quotation, but sometimes you may also supplement that with an event from the plot or perhaps a literary technique that is used in the text. It would be really useful if you could repeat this process for more than one theme from your text. I would suggest repeating it for 3 to 4 themes. So pause the video now and undertake that task.